Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So I'm again today recording from my girlfriend's sister's house in Michigan, so I don't have my usual setup. But anyway, today I wanted to talk about some recent developments in the U.S.'s incessant propaganda war against China, um, where over the years the U.S. has claimed that genocide was occurring in the Xinjiang province in western China, that China was suppressing pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, um, that their zero COVID policy was draconian and horrible, and then when they got rid of their zero COVID policy. Oh my God, they're trying to kill millions of people. So no matter what it does, even their high-speed rail system has been criticized by American media. So they really can't win no matter what they do. And I've talked before, both on my own and with my friend Jerry Gray, who's lived in China for 18 years, about all the mythology about China and how people who actually live there can see that it's a bunch of bullshit. Uh, and anyway, I'm sure you recall, just recently, the U.S. made a big to-do about a balloon from China that drifted over the United States. And as I'm sure hot air balloons are difficult to control. You can't really, I mean, where they go depends largely on the wind currents, or almost exclusively. Um, and so the U.S. accused China of sending a spy balloon over the U.S., which, I mean, it's just a ludicrous accusation, because if you wanted to spy on somebody, you wouldn't employ a technology where you couldn't control, whether it actually went over the place where you intended to spy. Um, and so basically, the pattern, just as with Iraq has weapons of mass destruction a few years back, was just simply to repeat over and over. Uh, China sent a spy balloon over the U.S. and eventually we shot it down. And just repeat that over and over without offering any evidence whatsoever at any point that it was actually a spy balloon. And we'll probably never know for sure what the nature of the balloon was, but China maintains that it was a weather balloon, much like weather balloons that countries around the world often send up into the upper atmosphere. But anyway, so after that hullabaloo died down, China did a couple of things. First of all, they excoriated the U.S. for its continuing efforts to dominate the world. Ben Norton talks about this report that the Chinese government issued. It was the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which published a lengthy report condemning U.S. hegemony and its crimes around the world, including wars with millions of victims, such as the Iraq War, coups, such as the one in Ukraine in 2014, or the one in Honduras in 2009, and so on and so forth, and regime change against elected leaders. For example, President Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2004 as well as 2014, and over 400 foreign military interventions. And some other time I'd like to talk in more detail about China's report. But in any case, my point here is that China's brutal criticism of U.S. foreign policy certainly riled the United States up. And this was followed up or I guess it was about the same time, China issued a peace plan regarding the Ukraine conflict. So, playing the new leader of the world, China just called for peace talks and a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine as part of a 12-point plan to end the war. Uh, these are the 12 points in China's proposal. This person says they sound pretty reasonable, to be honest. Respecting the sovereignty of all countries, abandoning the Cold War mentality, ceasing hostilities in Ukraine, resuming peace talks, resolving the humanitarian crisis, refugees and so forth, protecting civilians and POWs, keeping nuclear power plants safe, reducing strategic risks, arms control and so forth, facilitating grain exports with Ukraine and Russia both being among the leading grain exporters and producers in the world, stopping unilateral sanctions, where the U.S. has draconian sanctions on Russia as well as 38 other countries, including China, keeping industrial and supply chains stable, and promoting post-conflict reconstruction. And so, one response to China's peace proposal, as this person points out, China, we have a peace deal proposal between Russia and Ukraine. U.S., China is going to provide lethal aid to Russia. That was a major talking point for a few days. It's all this drumbeat of people saying China is going to send weapons to Russia. Now, I suppose that's possible, but at this point, there's no indication that China intends to do that, nor do I think would it be to their advantage to do so, nor does Russia really need any weapons from China. So that was one thing, and then another curious thing happened. In the Wall Street Journal, a fellow named Michael R. Gordon published an article claiming lab leak most likely origin of COVID-19 pandemic. Energy Department now says. U.S. agency's revised assessment is based on new intelligence. Now, in case that name, Michael Gordon, doesn't sound familiar, this was on September 2nd, 2002, in the New York Times. Threats and responses, the Iraqis. U.S. says Hussein intensifies quest for A-bomb parts. By Michael R. Gordon and Judith Miller. September 2nd, I believe that is, 2002. So, yes, this is the same person, one of the same two people, who played an instrumental role in popularizing the notion that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which was the primary justification given for the Iraq War. And now he's doing the same thing with the lab leak theory. Now, lots of people are promoting this idea that the COVID-19 pandemic originated as a result of a leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where coronaviruses of various sorts, none of them particularly closely related to SARS-CoV-2, were studied. And the lab was located there in Wuhan because it happens to be in the general vicinity of parts of China where there are lots of bat caves, where the bats in that part of the world, China, Laos, and so forth, are commonly harbor coronaviruses. And back in the early 2000s, of course, the SARS pandemic started in China, more in eastern China, whereas Wuhan is kind of in central China. But so SARS started in the southeast corner of China in Guangdong, I believe it was, and in that case, the origin was definitively traced to an animal market. They actually identified animals that tested positive for the SARS virus, and also later confirmed that very close relatives of SARS had been present in nature a few hundred miles away from where those animal markets were. And basically what seems to have happened is that bats somehow infected animals such as pangolins and I forget the names of the other animals that they found were carriers of the SARS virus, and those animals are farmed in China, illegally sold, wild animals, taken from or illegally farmed and then sold in Chinese wet markets, such as exist in Wuhan as well. Now, the central thing to note about the Iraq has weapons of mass destruction thesis that Gordon and others popularized back in the lead up to the Iraq War is that there was never any real evidence produced that Iraq had weapons of mass destructions, although there were attempts made by Colin Powell and others to fake evidence of Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. But the main thing they did was simply repeat that claim over and over again. Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. And another one was to imply that Saddam Hussein was somehow connected to the terrorists who destroyed the World Trade Centers on 9/11. There was no evidence for that either. But basically, if you repeat something over and over again, we psychologists have a name for this. If you repeat something over and over again, then it tends to be regarded as true, even if you never present any evidence for it. I don't have that here. Okay. I thought I had a reference to it in one of my articles. Let's see. Hold on a minute. Actually, I meant to find this article anyway. Repeated exposure to a given claim, whether it's from the media, the New York Times constantly repeating that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, or from people that we know, our circle of friends, who we tend to trust. That tends to lead us to believe whatever it is that we're hearing over and over again, even if it's not accompanied by any supporting evidence. This is called the validity effect or illusory truth effect. And social psychologists have documented that this happens, where basically what they did was, in a controlled experiment, they exposed people to various false claims that they just made up varying numbers of times. And then asked the participants in the study to rate how true those claims were. And they found a nice, neat pattern where the more people heard something, again, simply assertions without any evidence, the more people heard something, the more likely they were to believe that it was true. And that's kind of what's happened with both, or that clearly happened with the Iraq has weapons of mass destruction claim, and it's also happened with they claim that the COVID virus came from the Wuhan lab. Let's see, what was I going to show you here? Let me go back to this view while I look for things here. Okay, here we go. So there was a study by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting that found that 75% of the U.S. guests on network news shows during a week prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq were either current or former government or military officials. Only one of them, the Senator Edward Kennedy, expressed opposition to the impending Iraq war. Only 3 out of about 400 people interviewed over the months leading up to the invasion on various mainstream news outlets were unequivocally anti-war. And a few months prior to the Iraq War, 61% of the American public expressed oppositions to or reservations about invading Iraq. But by the time it was all over, or really before that, polls were finding that 69% of Americans believed that Saddam Hussein was involved in perpetrating 9/11. 93% believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And by this time, shortly before the invasion, the majority supported an invasion of Iraq. So you can see clear evidence there of how simply repeating something over and over without any evidence it tends to result in people believing it. I wrote an article over the summer analyzing how this worked with the lab leak theory, where basically there was this pattern where and I talked about this in a video a few months ago. Initially, Donald Trump and his allies in Congress and the right-wing corporate media, Fox and Newsmax and so forth, promoted the claim that the COVID pandemic came about through a leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab rather than the Wuhan market, where the first known cases had appeared. And so this built up over a few months, and by summer of 2000, a poll found that 30% of Americans thought that the COVID pandemic had come about due to a lab leak, even though Trump and Bannon and Tom Cotton and Brett Baer from Fox News and so forth never ever presented any evidence that this is actually what happened. And then, about a year later, when Donald Trump left office and Joe Biden came along, suddenly the liberal news media, such as, for example, the Washington Post, started pushing the lab leak claim. And, again, no evidence was presented. Sorry, hold on. One of the things that was claimed was that the Wuhan Institute of Virology studied bat coronaviruses. The lab was close, approximately 10 miles away from where most of the first infections were diagnosed, and there in Wuhan. And it was alleged that China had a lax safety record in its labs. No evidence was ever presented that China had a lax safety record in its virology labs. The WIV lab was located about 12 miles away if you drive by road, maybe 10 miles away as the crow flies, from the Hunan market where the first cases were detected, or near there they were detected. And, as far as anybody knew, there weren't any very close relatives to the SARS-CoV-2 virus being studied in the Wuhan lab or any other lab. Uh, at the time, the closest known relative to the SARS-CoV-2 virus was about 4% different from it genetically, which percentage-wise, that's a larger genetic difference than there is between, say, pigs and humans. So, as far as we know, the technology simply does not exist to bridge a genetic gap that large and create a whole new virus that is as different from SARS-CoV-2 as, as different, from the viruses that were known to be studied in labs at the time, such as RATG13. Um, you know, uh, SARS-CoV-2 basically, in a nutshell, was too different for current technology to have manufactured it in a lab. Um, and, there was all this evidence that where is this? There's all this evidence that uh, it was traceable to uh, the wet market. So there's the fact that SARS-CoV-1 infected humans in that way in uh, wet markets in Guangdong province. Um, there's just a precedent. Uh, every other epidemic that was caused by a novel virus wound up being traced to animals. Um, and a very large percentage of the early cases had some connection to animal markets. So, for example, 27 of 41 identified early cases were in people who had either worked at or visited the Wuhan market, this place here, which the Chinese government shut down and went into tests for signs of COVID and to test animals in the early months of the pandemic, in early January of 2020. Let's see, where was I trying to go here? Okay. So, a study published in Science magazine found that the vast majority of the early cases of COVID, there in Wuhan, were people who either worked in or had visited this particular market, or they lived near it. And on the other hand, when they looked at other cases, or excuse me, when they looked at the overall pattern of cases during those first couple of months of the pandemic, they did not find very many cases that weren't linked in some way to the market. And there are a lot of places in Wuhan that had or have a lot more visitor traffic than this particular animal market. They have big shopping malls and so on and so forth, where lots of people go, and yet there were not COVID outbreaks there initially. So this was the original super spreader event, or actually there were two super spreader events that came out of the Hunan market that were slightly different lineages of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. But basically what happened is that the Department of Energy, which what the heck does that have to do with studying viruses and their origins? The U.S. Department of Energy put out a report claiming that, let's see, where is it? SARS-CoV-2 originated with a lab leak. And this claim that the virus originated with a lab leak went viral, so to speak. So it was published in the Wall Street Journal. It was published in the New York Times. It was just all over mainstream media. Um, and no evidence ever presented that this was the case. So Angela Rasmussen, a scientist a virologist who has been involved in uh, seminal research on the origins of the COVID pandemic, uh, had this to say about these claims. She says the available evidence shows overwhelmingly that the pandemic started at Huanan market via zoonosis. But affirmative evidence of lab origin could change my view. What kind of evidence? She asks. First of all, I have no idea what this evidence the Department of Energy has is. All I know is that it is, quote, weak, according to their own report, and resulted in a conclusion of, quote, low confidence. It reportedly comes from the DOE's own network of national labs rather than through spying. But I do know that to be consistent with the available scientific evidence, the DOE has to explain how the virus emerged twice over 2 weeks in humans at the same market, the size of a tennis court, over 8 kilometers and across a river from the only lab in Wuhan working on SARS-CoV viruses. For more on, I'm not sure what SARS-CoVs are. I guess coronaviruses that are related in some way to SARS, such as that RATG13 virus that I mentioned earlier. In any case, she says, for more on that, you can see my thread on what my co-authors and I showed. By the way, today is the year anniversary of when we dropped the preprints of that research, eventually published in Science magazine last summer. No challenge to our work has yet survived peer review. So, what she said back then, where did the pandemic begin? Was it from nature or a lab? Since the start, this fundamental question has gone unanswered until now. So she talks about one paper that the team of them published that demonstrated through genetic analyses that there were at least 2 separate zoonotic spillover events at the Huanan market, probably a week or so apart. So in other words, for this to have come about through a lab leak would have to mean that people at the lab that was doing research on coronaviruses, the WIV lab, about 10 miles away, that people there got infected with COVID and visited the market on 2 separate occasions, at least, and that they were infected with different variants of the virus. And why would it show up there and not lots of other places is one question to ask. So anyway, she said, for the last 2.5 years, there's been lots of acrimonious debate on the various origin hypotheses. Much of it was data-free conspiratorial speculation. The only thing everyone could agree on was the need for an independent evidence-based investigation. We set out to do just that. And while the evidence base is incomplete, imperfect, and inaccessible in some cases, there is still evidence. Quite a bit, actually. All data points lead back to the Huanan seafood market. Yes, the data is incomplete and imperfect, but it overwhelmingly shows that the pandemic began at Wuhan through zoonosis, not at the WIV or any other lab. The evidence is stacked up for zoonosis. There remains no evidence for lab leak besides started in Wuhan. And she said that last summer. It remains true today as far as we know. Unless the Department of Energy has actual evidence that the virus actually got out of the lab in Wuhan, which nobody has ever presented any such evidence. They just say, oh, well, there was gain-of-function research going on in the lab. Well, maybe, but you still have to prove that, SARS-CoV-2 was in the lab, and B, that it got out of the lab. And neither of those things have been proven. So anyway, she goes on to say, let's start by looking at a map. These are the earliest cases of SARS-CoV-2 on record. They cluster around the Wuhan market, which is right there, and not the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is on the other side of the Yangtze River. It's somewhere over here. And most of the early cases, December 2019 cases, were not directly linked to the Hunan market, but you were in the neighborhood of the Hunan market. And there were quite a few that were linked directly to the Hunan market, who tended to live farther away because, people who visit or work at the Hunan market don't necessarily live right next to it, whereas people who live right next to it live right next to it. So this remains true, she says, the cases clustering around the Wuhan market, regardless of whether they were epidemiologically linked to the market or not. Later, this pattern becomes more diffuse as the virus spread throughout Wuhan. So you can see there in February 2020, there's the market, and the cases are all over the place. Still, relatively clustered around the market, but it's much farther out. And she points out not only are the early cases near the Wuhan market, but if you plot out the distribution, they are centered on it. And then the other thing that they showed, she asked, how do we know that Wuhan wasn't just a big super spreader event? Health officials knew early on that cases were associated with the market, so didn't they just look more there? Wuhan is a big city of 11 million people, and there are other places the outbreak could start. Looking at social media check-ins, they found that compared to other likely locations, including places considered high risk for super spreader events, places where, like shopping malls or supermarkets, places where there's lots of traffic, Wuhan market got very little traffic and was much, much less likely, all other things being equal, to be the site of an early super spreader event than hundreds of other places in Wuhan. The difference was that in the Wuhan market, they were selling animals known to be susceptible to SARS-CoV-2 infections. She says, we know that there were multiple animal species that are known to be susceptible to SARS-CoV-2 being sold at the Wuhan market in November and December 2019, such as raccoon dogs, red foxes, etc. And research was published documenting live animal sales of those animals in the Wuhan market. There were also environmental samples taken of from the lab after the Chinese government shut it down. And many of them tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, and they were in the parts of the market associated with live animal sales. And she addresses the issue of, when they tested animals from the market, why didn't they find any infected animals? And she points out, at the point in time when the market was closed, those animals that are known to be intermediate hosts of coronaviruses, such as raccoon dogs and so forth, were not present in the market. They had been pulled out of the market. So, likely that somebody tipped the vendors off, and they took those animals away, so the government couldn't arrest them because it is illegal to sell certain kinds of animals, wild animals, in the market. Anyway, what I want to emphasize is what Caitlin Johnston says here, that it's not a coincidence that the worst China hawks, such as Donald Trump, such as John Bolton, etc., have been in love with the lab leak theory from the very beginning. They understand that it can be used as a bludgeon against Beijing. And some people on the left who believe in the lab leak theory have claimed, yeah, it was a lab leak, but it was either funded by the United States or it was leaked from an American lab. And as I point out here, saying that the U.S. had a hand in it doesn't make it any less of a China-bashing conspiracy theory, because you're still saying that Chinese scientists, who overwhelmingly argue it originated in the market, because that's what the evidence suggests, are a bunch of liars. Because that is the case, that scientists in China overwhelmingly, the ones who have relevant expertise, overwhelmingly believe that it originated in the Wuhan market, because that's what the evidence suggests. And according to the administrators of the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab, they tested everybody in the lab for COVID. And didn't find any positive tests. Also didn't find any antibodies for COVID. And so basically, what it boils down to is, do you take their word for it or not? If you want to, you buy into the notion that Chinese scientists are a bunch of liars, because you want to believe in a conspiracy theory that says that it came from a Chinese lab, well, you're entitled to believe that, I suppose, but note that that is not evidence that the SARS-CoV-2 virus leaked from a lab. Because, again, the reason why there's a lab in Wuhan is that these types of viruses are native to that general area. And they put it there after the SARS pandemic, so they could more closely study coronaviruses. And again, what it boils down to is that this is just yet another opportunity to say China bad. That both the Trump administration and the Biden administration and all their supporters in the media and elsewhere have taken up as a means to smear China. And same technique as Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. You just repeat it over and over, and hope that eventually people will come to believe it. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Nazi Germany, said back in the day, if you want people to believe something, just repeat it over and over. Eventually they'll believe it. You don't have to present any evidence. All you have to do is just make it very salient in their mind. And that's how this works. That's a main aspect of how propaganda works. And certainly, as Angie Rasmussen says, where is it? if there's evidence, where is it? Oh, wrong thread. Sorry. She says, okay, if there's evidence that emerges of a lab origin, that could change my view. Um, but no such evidence exists right now, as far as we know. Um, and the evidence has to be evidence that you know actually shows spread from the lab. That there were COVID-2 viruses, uh, SARS-CoV-2 viruses in the Wuhan lab, and that they escaped from there. That somebody got infected and went elsewhere, for example. Until such evidence emerges, we cannot say that this is uh, how the COVID pandemic came about. Instead, what we can say is, well, we don't have a smoking gun because we'll never find the uh, animals that are susceptible to carrying SARS-CoV-2 that uh, may have been present in the lab at the time that the virus came along. Those animals were gone by the time the government inspectors arrived. So we will not prove as definitively as was the case for the SARS outbreak that SARS-CoV-2 emerged from an animal market. But there's all this circumstantial evidence that strongly suggests that this is how it came about. And in order for a lab leak hypothesis to uh, be shown to have plausibility, it has to account for that evidence. And that's a pretty hard thing to do because you have to account for two separate outbreaks occurring in the animal market and nowhere else in Wuhan at the time that the pandemic began. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about that today. I hope you've found this informative, and thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.